The wind didn't whistle through Redemption Valley. It screamed, scouring the dust from forgotten graves and carrying the widow's challenge like curse. If you're a real cowboy, her voice, colder than a gunsmith's steel, echoed across the desolate spread. Prove it on my stallion. 25 men had heard it. 25 men lay broken in spirit or bone. What awaited the next fool brave enough to answer? Gold? Land? Or just a grave beside the others? Redemption Valley lived up to its name only for the desperate. A vast, ochre bowl cupped by saw-toothed maces the color of dried blood. It baked under a relentless sun that bleached the sky to a brittle white. The air shimmered with heat, thick with the scent of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and the faint, metallic tang of distant, unseen ore. Silence wasn't peaceful here. It was oppressive, broken only by the rasp of wind over stone and the mournful cry of a lone hawk circling high overhead, a speck of shadow against the blinding expanse. At the valley's heart, like a fortress built against hope itself, stood Widow's Watch. The ranch house wasn't grand. It was a testament to endurance. Weathered gray timber, bleached silver in patches, supported a roof that sagged wearily under decades of sun and storm. The wraparound porch, once perhaps inviting, now seemed a defensive perimeter, its planks groaning underfoot like the bones of the Old West itself. Beyond the house, corrals built from gnarled juniper logs held nothing but dust devils, except one. In that largest corral, near the crumbling ruins of an old bunkhouse, resided the heart of the widow's defiance, Diablo. He wasn't merely a horse. He was a force of nature trapped behind wood. 17 hands high, his coat was the deep, bruised purple-black of a thunderhead just before it unleashes its fury. His mane and tail were tangled masses of jet, whipping like battle standards in the constant wind. But it was his eyes that truly stole the breath, liquid obsidian, burning with an intelligence that bordered on malice and a fury that seemed ancient, untamed by man or time. He moved not with the grace of a steed, but with the coiled, explosive power of a cougar, muscles rippling beneath his dark hide like currents in a midnight river. He didn't pace. He patrolled his prison, nostrils flared, ears pinned flat, challenging the very air. Diablo was less a creature to be ridden and more a storm to be survived. Eliza Thorne watched him from the shadowed porch, her figure a stark silhouette against the bleached wood. Time and grief had etched themselves on her face, not as weakness, but as the maces were etched by wind, carving lines of resilience and stern beauty. Her hair, once likely the color of sun-ripened wheat, was now a severe braided crown of silver-streaked ash, pulled tight from a face that held no softness. Her eyes, a startlingly clear gray like polished river stone, held the same unyielding fire as the stallion she guarded. She wore a simple, faded calico dress, practical and worn, but over it, an incongruously fine, dark wool riding jacket, meticulously brushed, the only relic of a different life. Her late husband, Silas Thorne, hadn't just been a cowboy, he'd been a legend whispered from Texas to Montana. He'd tamed the untamable, ridden where others feared to tread, and built Widow's Watch from sheer will. Consumption had stolen him 2 years past, leaving Eliza alone with the vast, echoing silence of the valley and the one creature Silas had called his equal, Diablo. The challenge wasn't born of malice, but of a grief so profound it had hardened into a test. Silas had always said a man's worth wasn't measured in draw speed or boast, but in the quiet understanding between rider and horse, in the courage to face the wild without breaking. Diablo, embodying that untamed spirit, had become Eliza's crucible. Ride Diablo for 10 minutes. Stay in the saddle. Prove you possessed the intangible essence Silas had embodied. The prize? A deed to prime, grazing land bordering the valley. Land that could turn a drifter into a cattle baron or a desperate man into a king. But the unspoken prize, the one that flickered deep within Eliza's stony gaze, was recognition. Proof that Silas's breed of man hadn't vanished from the earth. 25 had tried. Their ghosts seemed to linger in the dust kicked up by Diablo's furious hooves. There was Big Tom Henderson, a mountain of man from Kansas, all bluster and booming laugh. He'd swaggered into the corral, spurs jangling like cheap bells. Diablo had stood unervingly still as Tom settled his considerable weight. Then, as the foreman dropped the flag, the stallion exploded not upwards, but sideways, slamming Tom's leg against the corral post with a sickening crack before the big man even registered the movement. Tom's scream was swallowed by the valley's indifference. Then came the fancy rider from back east, Charles Davenport, dressed in tailored buckskins, speaking of equine psychology. He'd approached Diablo with soft words and sugar cubes. Diablo took the sugar, then promptly bucked Davenport over the corral fence before the 10-second mark, the Easterner landing in a dusty heap of shattered pride and expensive leather. Jedediah Quick-Draw Pike, a wiry gun hand with eyes like flint, thought speed was the answer. He vaulted onto Diablo's back like lightning. Diablo became the storm. A series of violent, twisting sunfishes, each landing jarring Pike's bones, culminating in a sudden, spinning pirouette that sent the gunman flying like a rag doll, his prize colt skittering uselessly across the dirt. Pike hadn't drawn his gun. Diablo hadn't given him a chance. The failures blurred into a grim tapestry. A stoic Sioux tracker thrown clean over Diablo's head. A boastful Mexican vaquero whose intricate silver spurs became tangled in the stirrups, leaving him dragged and bruised. A grizzled Pony Express veteran who lasted a remarkable 7 minutes before Diablo, seemingly tiring of the game, reared and fell backwards, forcing the old man to scramble free or be crushed. Each attempt ended the same. A cloud of dust, a cry of pain or fury, and the stallion standing alone in the center of the corral, head high, sides heaving, eyes blazing with undimmed defiance. He wasn't just strong. He was cunning, unpredictable, a master of equine warfare who seemed to relish breaking the spirits of those who dared. Eliza witnessed each failure from her porch, her expression rarely changing. A slight tightening around her eyes when bones snapped. A faint, almost imperceptible downward tilt of her lips when hubris was punished. The failures weren't disappointments. They were confirmations. The world Silas knew was gone, replaced by cheap imitations and hollow men. The land deed remained untouched in the iron box beneath her bed. Diablo remained unwritten. The silence of widows' watch deepened, broken only by the stallion's defiant challenges to the wind. 3 days' hard ride north, where the mesas gave way to rolling grassland scarred by cattle trails. The town of Bleakwater huddled around a brackish creek. It was less a town, more a collection of necessities clinging to survival. A saloon that smelled perpetually of stale beer and regret, the Dusty Spur. A general store perpetually low on stock. A livery stable smelling sweetly of hay and manure, and a sheriff's office that mostly collected dust. Inside the Dusty Spur, the air was thick with smoke and the low thrum of weary conversation. Lanterns cast flickering, inadequate light on faces etched by sun and hardship. At a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey that held more interest than the murky liquid within, sat Caleb Reed. He was a man who wore solitude like his worn duster coat, threadbare in places, but offering essential protection. Lean, not gaunt, with sun-bleached brown hair escaping from under his battered Stetson, he possessed a quiet stillness that set him apart from the boisterous miners and weary drovers. His eyes, a deep, troubled brown, held the distant look of a man perpetually scanning horizons for threats unseen by others. His clothes were functional: faded blue shirt, denim pants worn thin at the knees, scuffed boots, but meticulously cared for. A single silver concho, intricately tooled with an eagle design, adorned his hatband, a stark contrast to its otherwise rough condition. He spoke little, listened much, a ghost haunting the edges of other men's lives. A grizzled old-timer named Lemuel, his voice raspy as sandpaper, held court at the bar, recounting his latest journey south. And I'm telling you, Haas, that widow thorn down in Redemption Valley, she's plumb loco. Got herself a devil horse, black as sin and meaner than a stepped-on rattler. Says any man who calls himself a cowboy gotta ride the beast for 10 minutes. Prize is land. Good land, they say, bordering the thorn spread. A young cowboy, flush with bravado and cheap whiskey, snorted. Land? Shoot, Lem. I'd ride a grizzly for land like that. What's the catch? Lemuel spat a stream of tobacco juice accurately into a spittoon. Catch? The catch is 25 men tried. 25 men failed. Big Tom Henderson, leg busted clean through. Fancy Dan from Philadelphia, 8 dirt faster in a prairie dog. Quick draw pike, lost his famous speed and his dignity. That Stallion, Diablo they call him, ain't just wild. He's smart, vicious, like he enjoys it. Lemuel shook his head, a shadow crossing his weathered face. Widow just watches, stone-faced, like she's waiting for a ghost, or maybe burying the whole notion of cowboys along with her man. The young cowboy scoffed, but others around the bar shifted uneasily. 25 failures wasn't just bad luck, it was a curse. Caleb Reed hadn't seemed to be listening. He'd stared into the amber depths of his whiskey, his finger tracing a faint scar on the table's rough wood. But as Lemuel spoke of the widow's stone face, of the ghost she might be waiting for, Caleb's finger stopped. His gaze, previously distant, sharpened, focusing on nothing within the saloon but something far away, deep within memory. A flicker of something complex crossed his features. Not excitement, not greed, but a profound, bone-deep weariness mixed with a spark of recognition, or perhaps the stirring of a long-buried instinct. He didn't move immediately. He finished his whiskey, the slow, deliberate action of a man measuring every step. He placed the empty glass down with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden lull of the barroom chatter, which had momentarily dipped as Lemuel's tale concluded. Caleb stood, the scrape of his chair legs harsh in the smoky air. He adjusted his hat, the silver eagle concho catching a sliver of lamplight for a fleeting second. Without a word to anyone, without meeting the curious or pitying glances thrown his way, he turned and walked towards the saloon doors. The bat wings creaked shut behind him, cutting off the light and the noise, leaving only the vast, indifferent silence of the Bleakwater night. Outside, the wind, colder and sharper than down in Redemption Valley, tugged at his duster. He looked south, towards the unseen, jagged horizon where the mesas clawed at the sky, towards Widow's Watch, towards Diablo, towards a challenge that had broken 25 men. Caleb Reed didn't see opportunity in that southern darkness. He saw crucible, and perhaps, for reasons known only to him and the ghost that rode his own trail, it was a fire he needed to walk into. He swung himself onto his own horse, a steady, unremarkable bay gelding, and nudged it southward, leaving the feeble lights of Bleakwater behind, swallowed by the immense, star-strewn blackness of the prairie. The vastness swallowed Caleb Reed whole. Leaving the meager sprawl of Bleakwater behind felt less like departure and more like submersion into an ancient, indifferent sea. The grasslands, initially rolling and dotted with sage and bunchgrass, began to buckle and fracture as he journeyed south. Gentle swells gave way to deeper arroyos, their steep, crumbling walls striped with layers of ochre, rust, and bone-white clay. The air grew drier, sharper, scoured clean by a relentless wind that carried the scent of sun-baked stone and the faint, ghostly perfume of distant juniper. Caleb's steady bay gelding, aptly named Dusty, moved with the economical grace of an animal born to distance, his hooves crunching rhythmically on the gravelly trail. Caleb rode with the stillness of a man conserving energy, both physical and emotional, his gaze perpetually scanning the horizons, not for immediate threat, but as if reading the landscape like a map of his own troubled soul. The first day bled into the second, marked only by the sun's brutal arc and the lengthening shadows. Caleb spoke little, even to Dusty. His communication with the horse was a language of subtle shifts in weight, the gentlest pressure of a knee, a low murmur that was more vibration than word. He cared for the gelding with meticulous, almost reverent attention at each stop, checking hooves, offering water from his canteen before drinking himself, rubbing down the sweat-streaked coat with a worn cloth. It was a ritual born of deep respect, a stark contrast to the rough handling often seen on the trail. Watching him, one sensed a profound understanding of the creature's spirit, a kinship forged in silent miles and shared burdens. On the afternoon of the second day, the trail narrowed, winding through a labyrinth of sandstone hoodoos, wind-sculpted sentinels that cast long, twisted shadows. Caleb slowed Dusty, his hand instinctively drifting near the warren butt of his colt. The silence here felt watchful. Rounding a particularly sharp bend, he found the way partially blocked by a broken-down buckboard. A lone figure, an old man thin as a whip and bent like a wind-gnarled juniper, struggled to free a rear wheel sunk deep in a patch of deceptive sand beside the trail. A single, patient mule stood hitched, flicking flies with its tail. "Need a hand?" Caleb's voice, rough from disuse, cut the stillness. The old man startled, whirling with surprising speed, a weathered hand dropping to the ancient revolver holstered at his hip. His eyes, deep-set and milky blue but startlingly alert, scanned Caleb up and down, lingering for a fraction too long on the silver eagle concho. He relaxed minutely, though suspicion lingered in the tight lines around his mouth. "Could use an extra shoulder, stranger. Name's Ezekiel. Ezekiel Boone. Wheels dug herself in deeper in my regrets." Caleb dismounted, ground-reining Dusty. He moved to the buckboard, assessing the situation with a practical eye. Together, using leverage from a length of gnarled what Ezekiel produced, they heaved. The wheel groaned, sand sucked greedily, but finally, with a wet, reluctant sigh, it pulled free. Caleb wiped sweat and grit from his brow with his bandana. "Obliged," Ezekiel rasped, offering a canteen. Caleb took a small sip, the water warm and tasting faintly of wood smoke. "Heading far?" "South," Caleb replied, his gaze drifting down the trail that pointed like an arrow towards Redemption Valley. Ezekiel followed his look, his milky eyes clouding further. "South, eh?" "Towards Widow's Watch." He spat a stream of tobacco juice that stained the pale, sand-dark brown. "Heard the call, did ya? That widow's siren song wrapped in a dare." Caleb remained silent, but his stillness was an answer enough. "Fool's errand, son," Ezekiel said, his voice dropping, taking on a graveyard hush despite the empty landscape. "Seen the fallout myself, a week back. Past young Jimmy Faraday heading north. Wasn't nothing but a sack of bruises we pin on a swayback mare. Told me about the devil horse. Diablo." He shivered despite the heat. Said it weren't just bucking. Said it knew. Knew when to twist, when to slam ya into the fence, when to rear back like it aimed to crush ya under its own weight. Smart as sin and twice as mean. Ezekiel peered intently at Caleb, his gaze seeming to pierce through the present. 25, they say. 25 good men, some tough as saddle leather. All broken. What makes you reckon you're different? Caleb looked past Ezekiel toward the south. The wind whistled through the hoodoos, a mournful sound. He thought not of gold, nor land, nor glory. He thought of the crushing weight of failure, a different kind of corral. He saw, not the Stallion, but the aftermath of Chickamauga, the smoke, the screams choked silent by mud, the terrible stillness of fallen men wearing blue and gray alike. He saw the accusation in his captain's dying eyes, felt the phantom grip of a blood-slicked hand on his wrist, heard the choked whisper, "Read, tell them." It wasn't. Before the light faded, the memory was a physical blow, a familiar ache deep in his chest, worse than any bullet scar. He'd run from that battlefield, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being the one who walked away. The eagle concho on his hat felt suddenly heavy cold, a reminder of promises made and broken, a symbol he couldn't shed. Crucible. The word echoed in his mind, not as a challenge, but as a desperate need. A chance to face a different kind of annihilation, perhaps. Or maybe, impossibly, to prove something to the ghost that rode behind him. Was Diablo just another impossible thing to survive? Or was he the fire that could finally burn the past clean? He met Ezekiel's gaze, his own eyes shadowed canyons holding unspoken storms. "Don't reckon I'm different," Caleb said, his voice low and gravelly. "Just reckon I gotta see for myself." Ezekiel studied him for a long moment, the suspicion fading into something like weary recognition. He nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to encompass the vast, uncaring landscape and the burdens men carried into it. Aye, sometimes the seeing is the price itself. He climbed stiffly back onto his buckboard seat. "Watch yourself, son. That valley, it swallows hope whole. And that widow, she ain't just watching the riders. She's watching for something else. Something gone." He clicked his tongue, and the mule leaned into the traces, pulling the buckboard creakingly back onto the trail, heading north, away from the valley of broken men. Caleb watched him go, the old man's words settling like dust on his soul. She's watching for something else. Something gone. Did Eliza Thorne seek just a rider? Or was she, like him, haunted by an absence, testing the world for an echo of what was lost? The comparison unsettled him. He mounted Dusty, nudging him southward once more. The land grew increasingly severe. The arroyos deepened, their walls sheer. The mesas, glimpsed distantly at first, now loomed like the crumbling battlements of a forgotten, hostile kingdom. The air grew thinner, colder when the sun dipped, carrying the pervasive scent of dust and the faint, alkaline tang of dried-up playas. Caleb camped that night in the lee of a sandstone outcrop, a small fire fighting bravely against the immense darkness. He didn't sleep much. The wind moaned through the rocks, sounding eerily like distant cries. The flickering firelight played tricks, conjuring shapes from the past, the terrified eyes of a horse caught in barbed wire he hadn't been able to save in time, the accusing stare of a woman whose name was ash on his tongue now, the relentless advance of men in gray through Georgia's smoke. Each memory was a spur digging into his side. Diablo became intertwined with them all. Another force of nature hell-bent on destruction. Another test he felt destined to fail, yet drawn to nonetheless. Dawn painted the mesas in violent hues of red and orange, as if the very stone were bleeding. Caleb pushed on, the trail now climbing steadily towards a high pass etched between two massive, saw-toothed ridges. Dusty's breath came in plumes in the chilly morning air. As they neared the crest, the wind intensified, howling down from the heights with a voice full of grit and warning. Caleb pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. He reached the pass and stopped. Below him, unveiled like a secret held by the mountains, lay Redemption Valley. It was a vast ochre bowl, stark and beautiful in its desolation, exactly as Lemuel had described, yet infinitely more imposing in person. Sunlight, still low and sharp, carved deep shadows across its floor, highlighting wrinkles of erosion like scars on an old face. The air shimmered with rising heat. And there, nestled near the far end, dwarfed by the scale of the valley, but radiating a lonely, stubborn defiance, stood Widow's Watch. The gray timber, the sagging roof, the skeletal corrals. It looked less like a ranch and more like the last outpost before oblivion. Caleb's gaze swept the scene, taking in the immense silence, the crushing isolation. Then, as if summoned by his arrival, a sound shattered the morning. Not a whinny, not a neigh, a scream. It ripped across the valley, raw, primal, and filled with such untamed fury and defiance that it seemed to vibrate the very air Caleb breathed. It was the sound of a creature that refused the very concept of a rider, of dominion, of submission. It echoed off the mesa walls, multiplying, becoming a chorus of feral challenge. It was a sound that spoke of slammed bodies and broken bones, of hubris shattered. It was the voice of Diablo. Dusty shifted uneasily beneath him, ears pinned flat. Caleb didn't move. He sat rigid in the saddle, his knuckles white on the reins, his breath catching in his throat. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, a physical wave of pure, untamed power rolling up from the valley floor to strike him on the pass. The stories, Ezekiel's warning, the 25 failures, they coalesced into a terrifying reality in that single, savage cry. The crucible awaited, burning bright and brutal in the heart of the Ochre Bowl. Caleb Reed, haunted by ghosts and drawn by a need he barely understood, looked down at Widow's watch, and the stallion's scream echoed the turmoil in his own silent heart. The descent into Redemption Valley felt less like entering a place and more like stepping onto the surface of an alien, unforgiving moon. Caleb nudged Dusty forward, the trail switchbacking down the mesa's crumbling face, each turn revealing the valley's immense, suffocating scale. The Ochre Bowl stretched below, vast and silent under the climbing sun, its floor a mosaic of cracked earth, sagebrush islands, and skeletal stands of dead juniper. The air, thick with the scent of hot stone and parched creosote, pressed down like a physical weight. Dusty's hooves dislodged small avalanches of scree that clattered into the void, the only sound besides the wind's low, mournful drone and the rhythmic creak of Caleb's saddle leather. Widow's watch grew larger, no longer a distant speck but a stark, weathered monument to stubborn endurance against the valley's consuming emptiness. The corrals, especially the largest one near the ruined bunkhouse, stood out like a scar. As Caleb reached the valley floor, the silence deepened, broken only by the buzz of flies and the dry rattle of grasshoppers. He rode past a cluster of rough wooden crosses tilted haphazardly near a dry wash, mute testimony to failures that had gone beyond broken bones. Dusty's ears flickered nervously. Caleb's hand rested lightly on the gelding's neck, a silent reassurance. His own pulse, however, hammered a counter-rhythm against the oppressive quiet. He approached the ranch yard cautiously. The main house, Widow's watch, seemed to hunch under its sagging roof. The gray timber was bleached nearly white in places, the chinking between logs crumbling like ancient mortar. The porch, shadowed and deep, felt less like an invitation and more like the maw of a watchful beast. And there, in its darkest recess, stood Eliza Thorne. She materialized from the gloom as if summoned by his arrival, a statue carved from grief and granite. Sunlight, slicing through a gap in the porch roof, caught the silver streaks in her tightly braided hair and the startling clarity of her gray eyes. She wore the same faded calico and dark riding jacket Caleb had heard described, but seeing her in person was different. Her stillness wasn't passive. It was a contained intensity, a watchfulness that seemed to dissect him layer by layer. She held no rifle, made no threatening gesture, yet her presence radiated an authority as palpable as the valley's heat. Her gaze locked onto his, bypassing Dusty entirely, focusing on the man. It swept over his worn duster, his scuffed boots, and lingered for a fraction of a second too long on the silver eagle concho gleaming dully on his hatband. Her expression remained impassive, carved from the same wind-scoured stone as the mesas, but Caleb felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being measured against an invisible, impossible standard. Lost. Her voice cut the silence, sharp and clear, devoid of warmth or welcome. It wasn't a question expecting an answer about directions. Caleb reined Dusty to a halt, a respectful distance from the porch steps. He removed his hat, the gesture automatic, respectful, but also revealing the weary lines etched deep around his own troubled brown eyes. "No, ma'am." His voice was quiet, rough-edged, carrying easily in the still air. Heard there was a horse needed riding. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Eliza's face. Not surprise, but a tightening, a confirmation of expectation tinged with weary resignation. Before she could respond, a figure emerged from behind the dilapidated barn. A man built like a gnarled oak stump, thick through the shoulders, with a face the color and texture of well-worn saddle leather. He wore faded denim and a sweat-stained shirt, a coiled bullwhip hanging from his belt. He wiped greasy hands on a rag, his small, dark eyes assessing Caleb with a mix of curiosity and ingrained skepticism. "Another one, Miss Thorne," the man rumbled, his voice like gravel under a wagon wheel. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Caleb's horse. Dusty sidestepped nervously. Place is starting to feel like a bone orchard. He introduced himself without warmth. "Hank, Tim what needs tending here. Mostly burying pride lately." His gaze swept over Caleb, lingering on his lean frame. "You look like you've seen hard miles, stranger. You sure you want to add to the tally? That devil in the corral ain't partial to pedigrees or pity." Caleb met Hank's stare levelly. "Just here to see the horse, Hank." Hank grunted, a sound devoid of humor. "Seeing's free. Lasted longer in riding for most." He jerked a thumb towards the large corral. "Speaking of seeing, got a live one trying his luck right now. Fella from down Socorro way. Thinks his silver spurs make him charmed." Hank's expression was grimly expectant. As if on cue, a raw, furious scream tore through the valley air, emanating from the direction of the corral. Not the challenging cry Caleb had heard from the pass, but the sound of equine rage mingled with human panic. Eliza didn't flinch, but her gaze sharpened, fixed on the corral beyond the barn. Hank merely shook his head slowly, a gesture of weary inevitability. "Best views from the fence, if you got the stomach," Hank said, already turning to shuffle towards the corral. Caleb glanced at Eliza. Her eyes were still locked on the distant corral, her profile stark against the shadowed porch. She gave no indication she'd heard Hank's invitation, but her intense focus was permission enough. Caleb nudged Dusty forward, following Hank around the corner of the barn. The scene in the large corral unfolded like a brutal dance. Diablo stood in the center, momentarily still, a statue carved from living night. His coat, the bruised purple-black of a gathering storm, gleamed with sweat that darkened it further. His massive head was held high, nostrils flared red, eyes burning pools of obsidian fury. He radiated power not just in his musculature, but in the sheer, terrifying intelligence in his gaze. He wasn't merely reacting, he was strategizing. Astride him, clinging desperately, was a man Caleb vaguely recognized from Bleakwater Saloon, Rico Vasquez, a flashy vaquero known for his roping skills and ornate silver spurs. Rico's face was a mask of terror, his knuckles white on the reins, his fancy sombrero long gone. He screamed curses in rapid Spanish, sawing frantically at Diablo's mouth. The stallion ignored the bit, the pain seemingly fuel. Diablo didn't explode upwards immediately. He dropped his head low, almost docilely, lulling Rico into a fraction of a second's hope. Then, with viper speed, he pivoted his hindquarters sideways, slamming Rico's leg against the solid corral post with a sickening thud. Rico's scream cut off into a choked gasp. Before the vaquero could recover, Diablo launched into a series of bone-jarring bucks, not straight up and down, but in vicious, twisting diagonals, each jolt designed to loosen the rider's grip. Caleb watched, mesmerized and appalled. This wasn't blind fury. It was calculated brutality. Diablo knew exactly where the fence was, where Rico's weaknesses lay. He was playing a deadly game. Chickamauga. The name slammed into Caleb's mind, not as a word, but as a sensory flood. The choking smoke, the metallic stink of blood soaking Georgia clay, the deafening roar of mini balls shredding leaves overhead. He saw not Rico, but young Private Davies, green as spring grass, caught in a crossfire. Caleb had yelled, "Down, get down," but Davies, frozen by terror, had stood silhouetted against the smoke. The crack of the sharpshooter's rifle, the terrible limp collapse. Caleb, pinned himself, could only watch, the weight of helplessness crushing him more than any enemy charge. Should have moved faster, should have dragged him. The guilt was a familiar stone in his gut. Diablo, sensing Rico's weakening grip, chose his moment. He bunched his immense power and executed a perfect, terrifying sunfish. A leap combined with a violent arching of his back, twisting midair. Rico Vasquez, his leg likely shattered against the post, had no chance. He flew backwards, a tangle of limbs and silver spurs, landing heavily in the dirt outside the corral with a dull thud and a groan that quickly dissolved into ragged sobs. Diablo landed lightly, head high, sides heaving, steam rising from his sweat-darkened flanks. He trotted a tight, defiant circle, his obsidian eyes sweeping the fence line, landing briefly on Caleb. There was no triumph, only a chilling, ancient defiance. "I am not yours." Hank spat again, walking towards the moaning Rico with the resigned air of a man collecting trash. "Told him, them fancy spurs just give the devil something shiny to look at while he plans your downfall." He glanced back at Caleb. "See what I mean? Ain't a horse. It's judgment on four legs, and it finds every man wanting." He bent to help Rico, his movements rough but not unkind. "Come on, Rico. Let's get that leg looked at." Again, Caleb didn't move. He watched Diablo. The stallion had stopped his circling and stood now, facing Caleb directly across the corral fence. The fierce intelligence in those dark eyes seemed to pierce through him, seeing past the worn duster and the weary face, perhaps glimpsing the ghosts that rode with him. Caleb felt a strange sensation, not fear, though that was present, but a profound recognition. He saw in Diablo not just a wild beast, but a creature consumed by a refusal to be broken, a spirit that mirrored his own trapped fury and grief. Diablo wasn't just Silas Thorne's equal. He was Silas's legacy, untamed, unyielding, demanding a partner, not a conqueror. The warm memory receded, replaced by a different ache. The memory of Sarah's laughter by a creek, sunlight on her hair, a piece shattered not by bullets, but by his own inability to outrun the war within him. He'd failed her, too, by being only half present, haunted by fields of gray and blue. The crucible wasn't just about facing death. It was about confronting the failure that lived inside him. Could he meet this creature, this embodiment of defiant spirit, not with force, but with understanding? The thought was terrifying, alien. He turned Dusty slowly and walked back towards the porch. Eliza Thorne still stood in the shadows, her gaze now fixed on him, not the aftermath of Rico's failure. She had witnessed his stillness, his observation, his silent exchange with the stallion. Her expression remained unreadable, but the intensity of her focus had deepened. Caleb stopped before the porch steps, Dusty shifting uneasily beside him. The silence stretched, thick with the dust of failure and the echo of Diablo's challenge. Caleb met Eliza's gray eyes, those stones polished by grief and relentless scrutiny. He saw no encouragement, only the vast, lonely expanse of her own loss reflected back at him. He took a breath, the air tasting of dust and sun-baked wood and the sharp tang of horse sweat. His voice, when it came, was low, rough, but carried a newfound certainty that surprised even him. "I'll ride him, ma'am." The words hung in the air like gun smoke after a fatal draw. Heavy, irrevocable. "I'll ride him, ma'am." Silence, deeper than before, swallowed the yard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Dust motes danced in the harsh sunlight, slanting onto the porch, illuminating the stark plains of Eliza Thorne's face. Her gray eyes, those polished river stones, didn't widen, didn't flicker. They simply held Caleb's, measuring the quiet certainty in his voice against the weary lines etched around his own eyes. Hank, halfway to the groaning Rico Vasquez, stopped dead, turning slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and morbid fascination. Eliza didn't speak immediately. Her gaze drifted past Caleb, fixing for a heartbeat on the large corral where Diablo, having finished his defiant circuit, now stood unervingly still near the far fence, steam still rising faintly from his powerful flanks. His obsidian eyes were fixed on the scene at the porch, watching, always watching. When her eyes returned to Caleb, they held a question colder than the mountain streams that fed the valley springs. "You saw what he did to Rico Vasquez," she stated, not asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of inflection, yet it carried the weight of 25 broken men. "You heard Ezekiel Boone's warning. You understand the terms? 10 minutes. Unassisted. If you're thrown, broken, or step down, you leave. Like the others." Caleb met her gaze steadily, the silver eagle concho on his hat catching the light as he gave a single, slow nod. "I understand, ma'am." A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Eliza's face. Not approval, not encouragement, but perhaps the faintest shadow of assessment shifting. She gave no other sign. "Hank," she said, her voice cutting the tension like a blade, "see to Vasquez. Get him to the shack. Then, prepare the corral." Her gaze never left Caleb. "You have until sundown to prepare yourself, or reconsider." With that, she turned and disappeared back into the shadowed depths of the porch, swallowed by the gloom of Widow's Watch. Hank let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he finally hauled the whimpering Rico upright. "Sundown," he muttered, half to Caleb, half to himself. "Gives you time to write your will, I reckon. Or pray. Both might be wise." He half-dragged, half-carried Rico towards a small, dilapidated shack leaning precariously against the barn wall. "Come on, Rico. Let's see if that leg's as fancy as them spurs." Left alone in the sun-baked yard, Caleb felt the oppressive silence descend again, broken only by Rico's fading moans and the distant, uneasy shuffle of Dusty's hooves. The weight of his declaration settled on him, heavier than his saddle. 26. He'd be the 26th. Another name on the unspoken list, another cross by the wash. He dismounted, loosening Dusty's cinch, murmuring low reassurances to the skittish gelding. Dusty nuzzled his hand, seeking comfort in the familiar scent and touch. Caleb rested his forehead against the horse's warm neck for a moment, drawing strength from the simple, trusting presence. This he understood, this quiet language. It was worlds away from the calculated fury in the corral. He led Dusty to a patch of sparse shade offered by the barn, ensuring water was available. Then, deliberately, he removed his spurs, the jingle bobs falling silent. He unbuckled his gun belt, the familiar weight lifting from his hip, and laid it carefully across his saddle horn. He wouldn't need iron for this fight. This battle demanded a different weapon. Instead of heading towards the shack or seeking rest, Caleb walked slowly towards the large corral. He didn't enter. He stopped a few feet from the heavy juniper poles, leaning his forearms on the top rail. Diablo stood near the center, head lowered slightly, seemingly docile. But Caleb knew better. The stillness was deceptive, like the calm before a twister touches down. The stallion's ears, however, were pricked forward, swiveling minutely, tracking Caleb's every move. Those dark, intelligent eyes held no fear, only a simmering watchfulness. For a long time, Caleb simply watched. He noted the way Diablo shifted his weight, the subtle tension in the powerful neck, the slight flare of a nostril as the wind shifted. He saw the old scars, faint white lines against the dark hide, testament to past battles, past attempts at breaking. He saw not a monster, but a creature shaped by defiance, by the refusal of countless hands trying to impose their will. He saw himself, the man shaped by Chickamauga's smoke and Sarah's fading smile. Sarah, the memory surfaced, sharp and painful, triggered by the scent of sagebrush carried on the warm air. Not the creekside laughter this time, but the later days. Her face, pale against the pillow, the light in her hazel eyes dimming, replaced by a quiet sorrow he couldn't reach. "You're here, Caleb," she'd whispered once, her hand cool in his. "But you're not. Where do you go?" He hadn't had an answer then, lost in the gray fog of guilt that followed him home from the war. He'd failed her by being absent even when present, his spirit trapped on that blood-soaked Georgia field. He'd tried to outrun it, dragging her west, but the ghosts rode with him, whispering failures in his ear. Her death hadn't been his fault, a fever, but his inability to truly be with her, to offer the sanctuary she deserved, felt like the deepest betrayal. Should have been stronger, should have fought the ghosts instead of letting them win. A low snort from Diablo brought him back. The stallion had moved closer, still inside the corral, but now only a few yards from the fence, watching Caleb with unnerving directness. Caleb didn't flinch. He spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying just enough to reach the horse's ears over the sighing wind. "Easy now. Just looking. Seen a lot of hard miles myself." He wasn't trying to soothe or dominate. He was stating a fact, an acknowledgement. Know what it's like, feeling the hands that want to own you, the bits that want to break you. Diablo's ears flickered. He didn't retreat, but he didn't advance. His head tilted slightly, the obsidian gaze seeming to deepen, probing. Was it curiosity, or merely assessing a new threat? "Reckon you got your reasons," Caleb murmured, more to himself than the horse. "Just like I got mine. Ain't here to break you, Diablo. Just gotta see if we can face the storm together." For 10 minutes, a derisive snort sounded from behind Caleb. He turned to see a man leaning against the barn wall, watching him. It wasn't Hank. This man was younger, perhaps Caleb's age, but his face was drawn, one arm held awkwardly in a sling made from a faded bandana. His eyes held a bitter, haunted look Caleb recognized all too well. The look of a man recently bested, his pride ground into the dust. This was likely Jimmy Faraday, the sack of bruises Ezekiel Boone had mentioned. "Talking to it?" Jimmy rasped, a humorless smile twisting his lips. "Won't do no good, mister. That devil don't understand nothing but pain and fear. Heard you tell Miss Thorne you'd ride him. Brave. Or stupid." He pushed off the wall, wincing as he jostled his injured arm. "I lasted 45 seconds. Felt like an eternity. He ain't just strong. He knows. Knows when you're scared. Knows when you're off balance. He enjoys it." Jimmy spat into the dust near Caleb's boots. He jerked his head towards the silent house. "She just watches. Like she's waiting for something that ain't never coming." Silas Thorne. He was the only one who ever rode Diablo regular. Like they was partners, not master and beast. But Silas. Jimmy's voice dropped, tinged with a grudging awe. Silas was different. Touched by something wild himself, some said. Since he passed, he shrugged painfully. Diablo ain't accepting substitutes. And Ms. Thorne, she ain't looking for just a rider. She's looking for him, or his ghost. You ain't him, mister. You're just the next fool walking into the grinder. Caleb absorbed Jimmy's words, the bitterness, the warning, the glimpse into Eliza's profound, impossible quest. She's looking for him, or his ghost. It mirrored Ezekiel's warning about something gone. The enormity of it settled on him. He wasn't just facing a horse. He was stepping into the shadow of a legend, confronting the embodiment of a widow's unyielding grief. Could any man measure up to a ghost? The doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at his resolve. He turned back to the corral. Diablo hadn't moved. He stood watching Caleb, his dark eyes unreadable. The sun was dipping lower now, painting the western mesas in fiery oranges and purples, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. Sundown approached. The crucible awaited. Caleb pushed himself away from the fence rail. He walked slowly towards the water trough near the barn, dipped his bandana in the cool water, and wiped the dust and sweat from his face and neck. The simple act was grounding. He thought not of Silas Thorne's ghost, but of Dusty's trusting nuzzle. He thought of the quiet understanding he'd sometimes achieved with troubled horses before the war, before the ghost drowned out that gentler instinct. He thought of Sarah asking, "Where do you go?" He couldn't outrun the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could face it here. Not with force, but with presence. Not to conquer Diablo, but to meet him. He looked towards the porch of Widow's Watch. Eliza Thorne stood there again, a silhouette against the dying light. He couldn't see her expression in the gloom, but he felt her gaze, heavy and expectant. Hank emerged from the shack, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression grim. He walked to the heavy wooden gate of Diablo's corral and unlatched it, pulling it open just wide enough for a man to enter. He didn't look at Caleb. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. The only sounds were the wind sighing through the sagebrush and the restless stamp of Diablo's hoof inside the corral. Caleb took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust, cooling earth, and the sharp, wild scent of the stallion. He adjusted his hat, the silver eagle catching the last fiery rays of the sun. He thought of Chickamauga's chaos, Sarah's quiet sorrow, Jimmy's bitter warning, and Ezekiel's weary eyes. He thought of the silent challenge in Diablo's obsidian gaze. He didn't look at Eliza. He didn't look at Hank. He kept his eyes fixed on the open gate, the dark maw leading into the corral, and a magnificent, terrifying creature waiting within. The ghosts whispered, the doubt gnawed, but beneath it, a spark of that long-buried instinct flickered, the instinct to connect, not to break. Caleb Reed took the first step towards the gate. The scrape of Caleb's boot on the hard-packed earth sounded unnaturally loud in the suspended silence of the yard. He stepped through the narrow gap Hank had opened in the heavy juniper gate, the weatherwood groaning softly behind him as Hank pushed it almost shut. The world narrowed to the dusty circle of the corral, the fading light painting everything in long, bruised shadows, and the immense, dark presence in its center. Diablo stood stock still, head high, nostrils flared, steam curling faintly from his powerful shoulders in the cooling air. His obsidian eyes fixed on Caleb, radiating not just defiance, but a chilling, predatory intelligence. The scent of horse sweat, dust, and raw power filled Caleb's nostrils, sharp and primal. Beyond the fence, figures were dim outlines. Hank leaning on the gatepost, his face unreadable. Jimmy Faraday hunched on a barrel near the barn, his bandaged arm cradled. And Eliza Thorne, a stark silhouette on the porch, her face lost in shadow, but her presence a palpable weight pressing against the corral fence. The air crackled with anticipation, thick enough to choke on. Caleb moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his shoulders relaxed, his hands open at his sides. He made no sudden gestures, offered no soothing lies. He spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying only to the ears of the stallion. "All right, big fella, just you and me now." He wasn't asking for submission. He was stating the reality. He circled Diablo at a respectful distance, not approaching head-on, acknowledging the horse's space, his gaze never leaving those burning dark eyes. He saw the coiled tension in the stallion's muscles, the flicker of his ears tracking every shift of Caleb's weight. This wasn't brute force waiting to erupt. It was a coiled spring of lethal strategy. Diablo snorted, a puff of vapor in the twilight. He shifted his weight, a subtle warning. Caleb stopped circling. He stood his ground, perhaps 10 feet away. "Know you've seen him come," Caleb murmured, his voice a near whisper against the sighing wind. "Seen him try to break you. Ain't here for that. Just 10 minutes. Just see if we can stand the storm together." He took one slow step forward, then another. Diablo exploded. It wasn't the sideways slam he'd used on Rico. It was a blinding eruption straight upwards, a twisting, sunfishing leap that sought to dislodge Caleb before he even touched leather. Dust plumed around the stallion's hooves as he crashed back down. Caleb hadn't flinched. He hadn't moved closer. He simply stood, watching the display of power with a calm that bordered on reverence. "That all you got?" Caleb asked, his voice still low, almost conversational. The defiance wasn't challenging. It was acknowledging the horse's spirit. The stallion screamed, a sound of pure, outraged fury. He charged, not at Caleb directly, but parallel to the fence, kicking out with devastating force at the posts as he passed, sending splinters flying, the impact vibrating through the ground. Caleb tracked him, turning smoothly, his body loose, his mind a strange, hyper-focused calm. The battlefield chaos of Chickamauga tried to surge. The screams, the choking smoke, the sense of helplessness as men fell around him. He felt the phantom grip of a dying comrade's hand. Should have moved faster. But here, now, facing this elemental fury, the memory didn't paralyze him. It clarified. This was his choice. This was the crucible he'd sought. He let the memory flow through him and away, like water off stone. "Be here, Caleb. Just be here." Sarah's unspoken plea, finally heard. Diablo spun, lightning fast, and charged Caleb head on. Caleb didn't run. He braced. Then, at the last possible second, darted sideways with surprising agility, slapping the stallion's powerful flank as he thundered past. It wasn't a blow, but a touch, a connection. "Missed me," Caleb called, the ghost of something almost like humor in his voice. The stallion skidded to a halt, whirling, confused and enraged by the lack of fear, the lack of expected aggression. He eyed Caleb, head snaking low, ears pinned flat. He tried a different tactic, a sudden drop and roll, aiming to crush an imagined rider. Caleb just stepped back, watching the magnificent, dangerous display. "Clever," Caleb acknowledged. "But I ain't on you yet." The stallion surged to his feet, blowing hard. He tried feinting, sudden stops, violent head shakes. Caleb mirrored his energy, moving with a fluid grace born of hard miles and instinct, never closing the gap until Diablo paused, breathing heavily, sweat darkening his neck to almost black. The cunning fury was still there, but Caleb saw a flicker of something else. Assessment, perhaps even a sliver of uncertainty? This man didn't fight like the others. Now, Caleb moved. Not a rush, but a deliberate, confident walk straight towards Diablo's left shoulder. He kept talking, his voice a steady murmur, nonsense mostly, just a calming stream of sound. "Easy now, just gonna get acquainted, 10 minutes, that's all. Storms pass in." He reached out slowly, not for the head, but for the powerful curve of the stallion's neck. Diablo tensed, muscles bunched like granite, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. His eye rolled white. Caleb's hand hovered, inches away. He didn't force it. He waited. A heartbeat. 2. The rumble subsided fractionally. Caleb's palm made contact with the hot, damp hide. A tremor ran through the massive horse, but he didn't strike, didn't flee. Caleb's touch was firm, grounding, not possessive. In one smooth, continuous motion, born of countless mounts on skittish horses in the pre-dawn dark before battles, Caleb gathered himself. He didn't vault. He flowed upwards, using the momentum of his step and a gentle pull on the mane, not the reins Diablo despised, to swing his leg over the broad back. He settled into the saddle, Silas Thorne's old saddle. Hank had silently placed near the gate, with a sigh that was part relief, part acceptance of the inevitable storm to come. He gathered the reins loosely, giving Diablo's mouth all the room it needed. For one crystalline second, there was absolute stillness. Caleb on Diablo's back, the stallion frozen, head high, every muscle locked. The watchers beyond the fence holding their breath. The wind itself seeming to pause. Then Diablo erupted. It was as if all the fury of hell, all the defiance of his 25 victories, all the pent-up rage at the violation of his back, unleashed at once. He became a whirlwind of muscle and bone and unadulterated power. He sunfished with terrifying height, twisting violently mid-air. He bucked in savage, jarring diagonals, each impact threatening to shatter Caleb's spine. He spun like a dervish, slammed sideways against the unforgiving fence posts, Caleb yanking his leg up just in time, reared until he threatened to topple backwards, dropped and rolled with terrifying speed, Caleb kicking free of the stirrups and scrambling back as the stallion surged up. Dust choked the air, a thick, obscuring fog lit by the dying sun. Caleb's world became a blur of violent motion, burning lungs, straining muscles, and the relentless, thunderous power beneath him. He rode not with force, but with fluidity. He moved with Diablo, not against him. He shifted his weight instinctively, anticipating the twists and drops not through sight in the dust cloud, but through the telegraphing tremors in the stallion's body, the subtle shifts of muscle beneath his legs. He kept his seat loose, his grip on the reins minimal, his voice a constant, low murmur cutting through the stallion's screams. "I'm here, still here, ride it out, just the storm." Memories flashed. The chaos of Chickamauga, yes, but also Sarah's quiet strength during her illness, Dusty's trust as they navigated treacherous trails, the weary understanding in Ezekiel's eyes. He wasn't fighting a war. He wasn't running from ghosts. He was present, meeting the storm. "Where do you go?" Sarah's voice echoed, clear now. "Right here, darling," he thought, clinging not just to the horse, but to the moment. Right here, Diablo, sensing a resilience unlike any he'd encountered, redoubled his efforts. He executed a series of bucks, so violent Caleb felt his teeth rattle, his vision blurring. He almost lost it. Almost. He felt himself sliding, the ground rushing up. No, he dug deep, deeper than the battlefield terror, deeper than the grief. He found a core of stubborn endurance, honed by loss and miles, and the simple will to survive. He hauled himself back into the center of the saddle, gasping. "Not today, devil," he rasped. Something shifted. Diablo's next buck lacked its earlier murderous intent. The spin was slower, less focused. The stallion was tiring. But more than that, Caleb sensed a flicker of something else. Not acceptance, but a dawning recognition. This rider wasn't trying to break him. He was enduring. He was staying. Diablo let out a long, shuddering breath, more puff than scream. He trotted a tight circle, head still high, but the frantic edge was gone. He was testing now, probing the limits of this strange persistence. Caleb risked a glance towards the porch. Eliza Thorne had taken a step forward, out of the deepest shadow. The fading light caught her face. Her hand was pressed to her mouth. Her gray eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed not just on the rider, but on the way he rode, on the horse beneath him. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, gleaming in the twilight. Hank's voice, rough but carrying an unfamiliar note, boomed out. 8 minutes, 2 minutes, an eternity. Diablo gathered himself for one last, monumental effort. He reared, higher than before, a silhouette against the blood-orange sky, pawing the air with lethal hoofs. Caleb leaned far forward, wrapping his arms around the stallion's neck, speaking directly into a laid-back ear. "Easy, easy. I know. He poured every ounce of understanding, every hard-won scrap of peace he'd found in this maelstrom, into those two words. "I know." Diablo hung suspended for a heart-stopping moment, a statue of equine fury against the dying light. Then, slowly, incredibly, he lowered himself, not in defeat, but in cessation. He stood, sides heaving like bellows, sweat foaming on his neck, but still, utterly still. Caleb sat up slowly, releasing his grip on the neck, gathering the reins with hands that trembled only slightly. He didn't force Diablo's head down. He simply sat, breathing hard, feeling the immense heat and power of the creature beneath him, feeling the wild heart pounding against his legs. It wasn't submission. It was a truce, a mutual exhaustion, a recognition. The dust began to settle. Hank's voice, thick with disbelief, shattered the silence. 10 minutes. By God, 10 minutes. A ragged cheer erupted from Jimmy Faraday, quickly stifled by pain but genuine. Hank just shook his head, a slow, incredulous movement. Caleb didn't move immediately. He leaned forward slightly, resting a hand on Diablo's sweat-slick neck. "Told you," he murmured, the words barely audible. "Just the storm." Diablo snorted, a puff of warm air, but didn't flinch. He stood, accepting the touch, the weight, the strange stillness of the man on his back. Slowly, carefully, Caleb swung his leg over and dropped to the ground. His legs nearly buckled, muscles screaming in protest. He leaned against Diablo's shoulder for a moment, drawing strength, feeling the stallion's warmth, the slowing thunder of his heart. He looked into the obsidian eye. The ancient fury was banked, replaced by a watchful, weary intelligence. There was no bond forged, not yet, but a bridge, impossibly thin, had been thrown across the chasm. He turned. Eliza Thorne was walking across the yard towards the corral gate, Hank scrambling to open it fully for her. She moved with her usual contained grace, but her eyes, red-rimmed but dry now, held a luminosity Caleb hadn't seen before. She stopped just inside the corral, her gaze sweeping over Diablo, standing quietly now, then settling on Caleb. The deed to the grazing land was clutched in her hand. She held it out. "It's yours, Mr. Reed. You earned it." Caleb looked at the paper, then back at her face, at the lingering echo of Silas Thorne in her eyes, in the defiant spirit of the horse beside him. He thought of the land, security, a future. He thought of the ghosts of Chickamauga, the memory of Sarah. He thought of the crucible he'd just walked through and the fragile peace he'd found on the other side, not in conquering, but in enduring, in understanding. He shook his head slowly, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "No, ma'am. Reckon I didn't ride for land." He reached up and touched the silver eagle concho on his hat. It felt lighter now. The weight it represented, the guilt, the failure, hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was part of him, not a chain. "I rode." He paused, searching for the words, his gaze drifting to Diablo, who watched him with an unnerving stillness. "To see if I could still stand in the storm. To see if the ghost could be quieted." He met Eliza's eyes again. The ride, that was the prize. Eliza studied him, the deed still extended. The understanding that passed between them was silent, profound. She saw not Silas, but a man who had faced his own darkness and found a measure of peace. A man who understood the wild spirit not as something to break, but to meet. Slowly, she lowered the deed. She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of respect that held the weight of her grief and a dawning, reluctant acceptance. "The storm passes, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "But the ground remembers." Caleb nodded. He turned back to Diablo. He raised his hand slowly, palm open, towards the stallion's muzzle. Diablo stretched his neck, sniffed cautiously, then with a soft, almost inaudible blow, touched his velvety nose to Caleb's calloused palm. A benediction, a farewell. Caleb turned and walked towards the open gate. He didn't look back at Eliza or the deed. He collected his gun belt and spurs from his saddle, but left them unbuckled. He mounted Dusty, who greeted him with a soft nicker. The bay gelding felt solid, familiar, a reminder of the simpler bonds. He nudged Dusty towards the trail leading north, out of Redemption Valley. The sun was a molten sliver on the mesa rim, painting the sky in streaks of violet and gold. Behind him, he heard Diablo's soft snort, not a scream, but a sound like distant thunder rolling away. Eliza remained by the corral, a tall, lonely figure silhouetted against the dying light, one hand resting lightly on the top rail, watching the horse that was her last link to a love lost, now standing quiet in the gathering dusk. Caleb Reed rode towards the open horizon, the dust of Redemption Valley settling on his boots, the ghosts of Chickamauga and Sarah settling into stories, not shackles. He touched the eagle concho once more, then nudged Dusty into a steady trot. He didn't know where the trail led, only that he was finally present to ride it. The crucible had forged no conqueror, only a man who had faced the storm within and without, and found, in the heart of the maelstrom, a fragile, hard-won peace. He rode into the twilight, leaving behind the valley of broken men, carrying only the echo of thunder and the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest victory was simply staying in the saddle until the storm passed.